Many scary things can happen at sea, but there are no sea monsters, rogue waves, or pirates in this particular story. The question is, how do you take your terror? Well, if your answer was pure, unfiltered, and with a splash of flaming hot and choking claustrophobia, then that's what we're serving up in today's sea story, a real-life submarine horror story. Of the various stories I've actually heard from submarine veterans on USS Blueback, this one probably ranks as among the most terrifying, and ultimately this post is dedicated to the 3 men who perished in this fire. Now, fires on a ship are bad enough. A fire on a submarine is even worse. This particular story takes place on Bonefish in 1988. Now, as a quick disclaimer here, there's going to be a lot more information on the relevant blog post that I've written for this, so I'm only just going to cover some of the bare things of it. Then there's going to be a video after this, some actual footage where I kind of walk you through a Barbell-class submarine and give you an idea of some of the geography of what may have been going on. In contrast to most other sea stories, this particular one has verifiable documentation that has been sourced. So therefore, the following is my best attempt at reconciling the facts found in the official and unofficial documentation with what was found in the personal recollections. So any less would really be negligent on my duty as a historian. Still, inconsistencies between the various accounts are inevitable, such as the reality of attempting to corroborate facts in documentation with oral history interviews. And this is why I did not rely solely on personal testimony in this case. As such, this stands as but one interpretation of the events under discussion. Now, I am not trying in any way to discredit any survivor's recollection of this event, but it must be understood that human memory is imperfect and highly susceptible to influence over time. Additionally, the human brain tends to dilate or compress perceived time under extreme stress. So the timestamps should be viewed as a general indication of the sequence of events. Therefore, in instances where personal testimonies disagree with documented findings, generally the latter is used, and the appropriate sources have been cited. Of course, the views expressed here are the presenter's own and do not necessarily reflect the official policies or positions of either the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, OMSI, or the United States government. While strong efforts have been made to ensure accuracy, all information is subject to change without notice. All personal statements, opinions, omissions, and errors are the commentator's own. USS Bonefish was one of 3 Barbell-class submarines constructed. The others were USS Barbell and USS Blueback. These were the first production attack submarines with teardrop-shaped hulls, and the last class of diesel-electric attack submarines in the U.S. Navy. All 3 were commissioned in 1959 and served for about 30 years, being retired in the late 80s, with Blueback being the last in 1990. Our story begins in April of 1988. The final months of Bonefish's service were marked with difficulties. By April of 1988, she had been in service for nearly 29 years and was experiencing maintenance issues with several of her systems and pieces of equipment. Lieutenant Commander Pete Lestrange, Bonefish's executive officer at the time, recalls, "The ship had last been to sea in fall of 1988 and had returned from sea with a number of significant mechanical issues, including severe problems with her main engines, the air compressors, and the freshwater still. It appeared that it was going to take some time to return the ship to a seaworthy status. Additionally, crew morale seemed to have been very low at that point, although they were all working hard in trying to repair and maintain the submarine." Lieutenant Commander Lestrange adds that Bonefish had spent about 3 months undergoing maintenance and was scheduled to get underway for a quote-unquote fast cruise, which would last around 1 or 2 days to test her systems. This event was also canceled due to the commanding officer, Commander J. Toney, being replaced by Commander Mike Wilson. In the XO's opinion, once Commander Wilson replaced Commander Toney, the crew's morale significantly improved. The repairs were completed and the scheduled fast cruise was completed. Bonefish got underway for 3 weeks at sea in early April. The first few days focused on testing the boat's systems as well as crew training and qualification. This was followed by a submarine versus submarine exercise with a nuclear-powered Sturgeon-class boat. Following that exercise, she turned south-southeast and proceeded to a rendezvous with the USS John F. Kennedy carrier battle group. Around the same time, the Oliver Hazard Perry-class guided missile frigate USS Carr also got underway from Charleston, South Carolina, with Lieutenant Commander Wade C. Johnson in command. They would arrive in the Jacksonville operations area and rendezvous with the John F. Kennedy and Bonefish to conduct anti-submarine warfare exercises. On 24 April 1988, Bonefish was about 160 miles off the eastern coast of Florida in the Atlantic Ocean. Bonefish was simulating an enemy diesel-electric submarine attempting to, quote-unquote, sink the carrier with USS Carr and an SH-3 Sea King, callsign Dusty 613, from USS John F. Kennedy tracking her as part of an ASW exercise. Now, our featured tour guide for this story is the volunteer tour guide Rick Neault. Rick is a former quartermaster second class. Unlike the land forces where quartermasters are in charge of supplies and provisions, in the Navy they're actually responsible for navigating a vessel. Now, as of 2024, OMSI has only 2 tour guides, both volunteers, who served on the 3 Barbell-class submarines between them. In Rick's case, he served on USS Bonefish from 1984 to 1988, and after that on USS Blueback from 1988 to 1989, currently making him the only tour guide who has served on Blueback herself, and of course 2 of the Barbell-class submarines. Consequently, he actually knows Blueback better than any of us, and we generally always pick his brain whenever he comes on board. So with that, let's hear Rick's version of what happened that fateful day. Hello everyone, welcome back to Down Periscope, Up Periscope, Tales of Submarine Tours. Now, here we have a very special tour guide, one of the only tour guides we have on our staff, a volunteer tour guide by the name of Rick Neault, who served on the Blueback herself. But this particular story does not come from the Blueback. It does come from another Barbell-class submarine, the Bonefish. Now, the Bonefish suffered a very serious tragedy in April of 1988, and Rick is here to tell us his side of that story. Hello, Rick.
How you doing?
Very good. So, Rick, why don't you tell us about that fateful day of 24 April 1988?
Well, we were doing an operation with Kennedy Carrier Group off the coast of Florida, and we were getting ready to begin another phase of the operation when we had just finished charging our batteries, shut down the engines, and the boat started heading down. And when the boat took a down angle to go down deep, there was an issue in our battery well. So they informed us in the control room, and so the electricians were supposed to go into the battery well and try to figure out what the problem was. And it had to do with the ground on the battery. So we got down to 200 feet. They sent a guy in the battery well, and he saw smoke and sparks and called out that there was a fire in the battery. Then from that point on, it was just trying to get ourselves back up to the surface so that we could figure out what's going on and start fighting the fire. So it probably took us about 10 minutes to get back up to what we call periscope depth, which was about 60 feet under the surface. And we got up there, they stuck up a couple periscopes. We were hanging out there just to see if we could figure out what's going on and figure out to do something before coming to the surface. And it was at that point that the fire actually flashed and it filled the boat with this really, really thick black smoke. At that point, we had to emergency surface so that we could get the thing under control and get the smoke cleared out, because you can't really do a lot when you have really thick black smoke. So we got up to the surface and we used the engines to suck the smoke out of the boat. So they cranked up the engines and they sucked the smoke out, and it was at that point that we noticed one of the first victims. We had 3 crew members that died. He was the officer of the deck, which is in the control room where I was. He was about 6 feet away from me. He was lying on the floor. He had succumbed to smoke inhalation because he didn't have a mask on and he was trying to get our hatch open, and the hatch wouldn't open. He had inhaled, the smoke was really thick and black, and you could literally feel it with your hands. By the time the smoke cleared and they were able to get to him and see what was going on, that black stuff had pretty much coated the inside of his mouth and lungs and everything, and he was pretty much gone. His name was Ray Everts. They had got the smoke cleared. The rest of the crew fighting the fire, pretty much in the crew's berthing space on the port side, trying to fight the fire from there. But they had to pull the bunks out because that was berthing space. So to get to the fire had flashed up into the hull insulation. So they had to get the bunks out and get the stainless steel covering off the wall so they could get to the actual hull insulation that was on fire. And that was the problem. They were just really, really having a hard time getting to the hull insulation. So for a period of about 15 minutes, they were trying to do that when there was an explosion. It was a minor explosion, and it caused a fireball, believe it or not, to shoot out of an electrical panel and kind of traverse the beam of the boat. And there was about 3 crew members there that were fighting the fire that were burned by that. And so they had to be taken out of the area and get replaced by some other guys. That's not an instantaneous process. That takes time. So by the time they got those guys out and got some replacements in, there was another minor explosion. I think they were calling them flashovers. But there was another minor explosion. At that point, the fire had worked its way up through the insulation and forward. And so at that point, it was behind the radio room and sonar, and it was actually coming up just behind the ballast control panel and getting into the quartermaster stand and the radar ESM area. And that's when myself and the chief of the watch grabbed some fire extinguishers and started basically sticking the cone of the fire extinguisher up to the holes that were in the paneling. And then when the flames would come up, we just shoot it with some CO2. Then there was the flashover again, and at that point it was when the fire finally melted through the hydraulic lines and had melted through the emergency air breathing lines. So when we have a fire, we have these masks that we hook into this air system. It's called the emergency air breathing system, and that's how we breathe and fight fire or get out or whatever. And by that time, we were starting to inhale smoke. So it was at that point that the decision was made. The smoke came back and they cranked the engines up again to try and get the smoke out, but the engines wouldn't run because it had just finally clogged the engines. And so it was at that point the captain said, he didn't actually order us to abandon ship, he ordered everybody to go topside. I didn't even actually hear the order. Chief of the watch, who was helping me, basically tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, Rick, everybody's gone, let's go. I didn't even know we were supposed to leave, so I believe he went up the hatch first, and then I went to go up the hatch, but the EABs that we wore, they had a regulator on our belt, and the clip that held the regulator in place had a curl. It curled up, and so what would happen is you go to take the regulator off, and that hook would catch your belt, so you couldn't get it off. So I tossed my mask and started to go up the hatch, and I could only go so far because my hose was only so long. And basically at that point, I was just breathing in black smoke. Essentially what I did is I just grabbed onto a rung on the ladder and I just pulled as hard as I could, and somehow it came off and ripped my shirt. But by then I wasn't too worried about my shirt. So then that's how I got out. I went up the hatch, got up into the bridge, and it was literally like standing in a chimney. The black smoke was, if you've ever seen the pictures, you can see the black smoke going up. And so I get up there and there's no air still because I'm still breathing black smoke. So I actually had to stick my head out over the side of the sail to get a breath of air. And then I just started throwing up and coughing, and it was pretty disgusting. And then I was able to make my way over the side of the sail. We had welded on rungs on the Bonefish sail, so we could step down to the sail water planes and then get on another set that would take you down to the deck. And then I got onto the deck and I started to walk aft to the bigger area of the boat. And it was about 10-foot seas, so we were rocking a bit. And a wave came up and knocked me and another guy off the boat. And so we got to float around for a little while until we were plucked out of the water by a helicopter. I don't know if you've ever experienced throwing up while you're in the water. Yeah, it's not fun. I got picked up by a helicopter. They took me and the other guys, and we were put on the USS Carr, which was a frigate that was there. And we were on there for a couple days till we got back into Mayport, Florida.
Well, that's quite a story, Rick. And for listeners out there who aren't aware of what a submarine is, it is a big enclosed steel tube. And Rick, as you mentioned to other people, you were up in the control room and the smoke filled it within maybe a second or two.
It was instantaneous.
And it was thick black. You could feel it in your hands. And if you're thinking like, oh, well, it's just smoke. No, you are completely disoriented. You can't see your hand in front of your face. Whatever lights were on in the room were no longer visible. It would be probably the most terrifying experience you've ever felt. And you and many others climbed out up the bridge hatch, up the sail, which is, like you said, essentially a giant chimney. And again, we'll see pictures here of what's happened, and you see thick brown black smoke just pouring out of this sail.
Yep.
That is crazy. Well, luckily, the vast majority of the crew survived, but sadly, you lose 3 men of your crew, Lieutenant Everts, Robert Bordelon, and who was the last man?
Lingering. Yeah. Todd
Lingren. As anything else, we tell these stories so we can remember those men and carry on their memories and honor them.
Yeah, and remember, too, those are the 3 that died that day. We were all affected physically by the smoke or burns, and many guys have died since then from things directly related to that fire.
Thank you very much, Rick, for that story. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, well, that was a pretty harrowing account of that fire, at least from Rick's perspective. Now, I'm leaving out the discussion on the overall timeline of the events. You can find that on the blog post that will be linked in the description. I'm going to continue on and discuss a bit about the evacuation and the overall fate of what happened to Bonefish after the fire, and then we'll have some footage where I walk through Blueback and give you some geography of what happened. In terms of the evacuation, the problems did not end for the crew once Bonefish surfaced and the crew evacuated to the topside deck. The escape provisions for a submarine at the time assumed that the crew would need to escape from a sunken submarine in relatively shallow water. As such, there would be enough escape appliances, at this time stanky hoods, for each individual. However, it was not assumed that the crew would need to escape from a surfaced submarine. Hence, there were only 2 life rafts available, each with a 7-person capacity on Bonefish. When USS Carr arrived to assist, they began readying their SH-60 helicopter and put their motor whaleboat along with various inflatable life rafts into the water to provide assistance. Ultimately, Carr would end up controlling 5 helicopters and a fixed-wing aircraft during the rescue. Jim Chapman, a crewman aboard the SH-3 Sea King Dusty 613 from John F. Kennedy, had been tracking Bonefish on her dipping sonar as part of the ASW exercise. Now, referencing the original sonar log recorded during the ASW exercise, he recalls, quote, "For us, the ASW exercise began at 15:55, 24 April 1988. Our first simulated attack occurred at 16:22. At 16:28, I heard what sounded like an explosion and frantic UQC transmission. Still unsure of the significance of the UQC, at 16:30, Bonefish was still submerged with a bearing of 262 up Doppler and within 1,500 yards, so Lieutenant Commander Wakewitz, my pilot, and the HAC ordered another simulated attack. We continued to hover above and track the submerged Bonefish, unknown to us but fighting the fire, until it surfaced at 16:40. Hovering less than 100 yards from the now surfaced Bonefish, the HAC immediately radioed the USS Carr of the unfolding emergency. The Carr ordered us away, saying that they were en route, but our HAC replied, quote, "Negative, we are commencing rescue operations at this time," end quote. Below us, the Bonefish crew began frantically pouring out of the hatches like ants out of an anthill on a hot summer day. They desperately jettisoned their breathing devices, we call them OBAs, and melting boots. Meanwhile, the USS Carr was flailing to put their H-60 out of the barn to prepare for their rescue attempt. What Commander Johnson could not understand from his vantage point is that I was doing a triage from the air as to which Bonefish crewmen to take next. I took the most injured first. The Bonefish crew members, under direction of my hand signals, passed the rescue strap from man to man until I got to the right person, most injured. It is noted that there was one instance where a partially unconscious, heavy-set crew member lying on the sail was put into the rescue strap facing backwards, but due to the seriousness of his condition, I assessed that it was worth the risk to continue the evolution and successfully brought him aboard the helicopter. Dusty 613 was on sea during the initial explosion and fire and remained in position above the Bonefish until it surfaced, and only left the scene after we could not physically fit any more souls aboard. I saw the H-60 lower Mr. Brian Hendricks to the Bonefish, which was well after I had already rescued 9 of the most injured submariners, and delivered them to the USS Carr. By the time the H-60 finally came into play, I had already rescued 12 Bonefish crewmen, most critically injured. I rescued a total of 24 that day. Due to the severity of the fire/smoke and the risk of further explosions during the initial phase of the rescue, we were ordered by higher authority to not put any more personnel aboard the submarine." End quote. A particularly difficult hoist involving Dusty 613 involved them lowering the horse collar down into the submarine through the aft deck hatch. As they began to hoist the survivor up, Chapman noted that the helicopter blades were flexing, indicating that it was struggling to stay within its performance envelope. Since this was a hot day, with the thinner air and they were hovering over a burning submarine, the helicopter was already struggling to stay aloft. Just as Chapman was about to shear the hoist cable to save the aircraft from crashing, a 250-pound sailor reportedly popped out of the hatch, dangling from the horse collar. The executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Lestrange, writes this of his evacuation. Quote, "I eventually exited through the hatch at the submarine bridge after first attempting to verify that the rest of the control room personnel had already evacuated. I believe that I was the last individual to use that evacuation path, although there is speculation that one or more crew members may have used that route after I did. In my opinion, the submarine bridge route was the most dangerous, since the sailor had to take off his EAB at the base of the exit ladder and then climb up the ladder to the bridge without an air source while completely engulfed in a column of thick, toxic smoke. Not surprisingly, more than a few of the crewmen that were subsequently hospitalized for smoke inhalation had used this exit route. When I arrived on deck, I could see the USS Carr, one covered life raft, and a motor whaleboat. I began pacing the deck to find the CO, to count the heads, and to try to keep everyone as organized and as calm as possible. The head count turned out to be close to impossible. After an indeterminate period of time, the torpedo room hatch and the aft midships compartment hatch were both shut. The bridge hatch, however, remained open because the billowing smoke was by now so thick and toxic that none of the crew could survive climbing back down into the bridge cockpit to shut it. I later recall reaching down and doing a temperature check on the exterior of the submarine's hull. It was distinctly hot to the touch. I recall wondering if the Bonefish would literally blow up underneath us before the evacuation was complete. The last evacuation helicopter flight picked up 3 personnel, one last crew member, the CO, and I. I recall looking at my watch and noting that it was about 20:30. The helicopter flew to the USS Carr, and the CO and I headed for the ship's bridge. I was detained and diverted by what I remember to be a very large and muscular warrant officer. I would later look in the mirror and come to understand why, who demanded that I follow him to sickbay. I protested, but eventually ended up doing things his way. I was soon parked in a chair and sucking on an oxygen tank. I also quickly learned that Salvadine cream is great stuff for burns." End quote. Now, Fire Control Technician Bill Baker remembers this of his evacuation. Quote, "I ended up on the aft deck just past the sail. When the boat would go down in a wave, it would lift us up, and when the boat would come back up, we would scramble back to the center and attempt to hold on to the safety track and each other. When it was my turn to go, I go up, went to the side of the sail, and threw my new sneakers into the water. When the lifeboat got close and the boat was up and going down, I jumped on top of the raft and pulled myself inside. The next 2 hours were some of the worst of my life. I was seasick, and the only place I could throw up was to unzip my poopy suit and throw up into it. I was by a hatch, but I couldn't lean out. I remember just wanting to close my eyes and sleep. TMC Blackburn grabbed my hand and told me I could close my eyes, but I had to occasionally squeeze his hand to let him know I was still alive. I appreciated that. After a while, a diver came to the hatch, and we were taken out one by one to a helicopter. I remember when I was in the water with the guy holding me, telling me what was going to happen. I threw up on him. To his credit, he just washed it off and kept going. He later ended up on the Kennedy on a makeshift bed next to me. He had rescued about twice the number of people he was supposed to. From the helo, I was deposited on the USS Carr, and I remember a gung-ho corpsman, he had just finished a tour with the Marines, came up to me. All I wanted was to get horizontal. They took my clothes and gave me a dry poopy suit, and I laid down. I got an IV, and they then transferred me to the Kennedy. As a direct result of the fire, 21 injured crew members were evacuated for treatment at the Naval Hospital in Jacksonville, Florida. Now we will discuss the ultimate fate of Bonefish. USS Hoist arrived to tow Bonefish back to Charleston, South Carolina, and moored her next to the submarine tender USS Frank Cable. Her torpedoes and other sensitive materials were removed while the Navy began its investigation, which included interviewing the surviving crew members. The investigation would ultimately last until the end of the year. Rick Neault later told me that, as a quartermaster of the watch, he was maintaining the deck log at the time of the fire. However, the smoke had completely ruined the paper of the log. As a result, he actually had to recall details of the events purely from memory. Several officials from the submarine force toured Bonefish after she was recovered, their intent being to learn about the material hazards of the boat so they wouldn't be repeated during the design of the then new Seawolf class. Reportedly, many were shocked that 89 crewmen managed to survive given the intensity of the fire and the state of the Bonefish's interior. In June 1989, the damage to Bonefish was deemed too extensive, and the Navy decided to dispose of her. Bonefish was decommissioned on 28 September 1988 and towed to New Orleans for scrapping in August 1989. Again, if anyone is interested, please reference the blog post of this video, where you will find more information on the ultimate summary findings from the U.S. Navy investigation about the cause of the fire and the material deficiencies that Bonefish was experiencing. But thus ended the service of USS Bonefish, SS-582, and the lives of the 3 of her crewmen. Many of the survivors continued to struggle through their ordeal, and while others have done their best to come to terms with what they experienced. But as always, we shall do our best to keep them in our memories. And it's also worth noting that this post was published on the 36th anniversary of the Bonefish fire. So may those men and the event never be forgotten. Thank you.